Welcome to the Triclinium, a podcast named after the three-sided table used in the Lord's Supper, where you are invited to join the three of us as we think through matters of Christian faith, practice, and community. My name is Nate Lead, and I'm here with my co-hosts, as always, Eric Burgers and Jacob Hawley, and today we're going to be talking about fasting. So, to get us started, I just wanted to ask you guys, what's your experience been with fasting? Do you guys have a regular rhythm of fasting? And what does that look like for you guys?
Oh man, we've been in the theory world for the past, a long time, and I feel like I just got called out. What's my past with fasting? Not great. I am no expert.
That's important though, Jacob, because I feel like, especially for me too, I get so caught up in conceptual ideas and conceptual abstract theology that I don't feel like we've talked about, well, we have, but probably not emphasized nearly enough the practicality of some of our theology as well. So I think this will be a healthy conversation.
Oh man, all right, fine. Yeah, I weigh, and don't tell anybody this is a secret. I weigh 105 to 110 pounds at any given point.
Don't tell anybody, but I'm going to say it for everybody to hear on the podcast.
Yeah, it's my little secret. So I can't make it fasting very long. So there was a point this last year where I was doing little segments of fasting. I would say my fasting is not a regular rhythm. It's pretty sporadic. I can usually make it up to missing 2 meals in a row, but after about 2 meals, I start getting lightheaded and I can't think straight. I'll usually get a pretty rick-roaring headache. So I think I said rick-roaring. I think it's rip-roaring. That was funny.
I've never even heard that saying.
I know.
Yeah.
I didn't know what you're talking
rip-roaring
about.
good time, but Rick roaring, like Richard roaring, I guess. I don't know. That was a weird slip of the tongue. But anyway, so mine has been sporadic. I have a funny story related to fasting. I was a kid. I was probably 18, 19, just fresh out of high school. I was interning with a guy at my church, and awesome guy. He was one of the biggest mentors in my life. Anyways, I had this heartbreak. It was a romantic heartbreak moment. And he saw how distraught I was, and so we went out fasting. And so we went to the grotto and we walked around, and this was, I think, my first real time fasting. I don't think I had fasted before this. And we drank so much coffee that morning, but we didn't eat anything.
Oof.
And he was diabetic.
Oh,
so we pull up in the parking lot, and he goes, "Listen, man, I think I'm gonna be fine, but in case I'm not, here's this pen, and if I start going into diabetic shock, I need you to jam this thing into my leg as fast as you can." And I was I feel like you should just eat something. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to play this game. I didn't realize this is a life. I didn't realize your life was on the line here. So anyways, I was just walking around, and I'm trying to pray and be all spiritual, but half the time I'm just thinking oh my gosh, please don't go into diabetic shock. Please don't go into diabetic shock. So it was pretty bad. And then we were both completely destroyed that evening because we had just downed so much coffee that morning and eaten nothing. So all our energy was just gone. But yeah, so There's my funny story.
Was he okay? He didn't go into diabetic shock?
Oh yeah, he was fine. He was fine. He knew himself pretty well, but yeah, that was a weird.
That would be very stressful.
Yeah, I felt like I was a nurse walking around with him the whole day.
Probably not the best introduction to fasting.
No, but it was great. It was actually a really meaningful experience for me because he tied fasting to an incredibly practical, the theory of fasting. He tied it to an incredibly practical outlet for me. I was deeply sorrowful that day, and he made it a meaningful. He gave me a way of kind of dealing with my sadness was that felt right. So,
yeah, I feel like that's kind of a healthy, even like just biblical way of approaching fasting too. Like, how many times do you read? I think both Old and New Testament, but I have the Old Testament specifically in mind. Like, there was weeping and fasting, or like prayer and fasting, or like over some cataclysmic event that happens if there's some sort of judgment or something. I'm thinking mostly of times of exile that you see, where the people are just mourning and fasting and weeping. But it's, there's something about, I think maybe we should talk about like the underlying principle of what fasting is, because like I think the reason you see that so repetitively like throughout the Old Testament is like fasting is there because it's almost like a recognition. Well, you're recognizing something's going wrong, and I'm speaking in this category of like how you see in the Old Testament, it says mourning and then fasting or something like that. Something's clearly gone wrong, and fasting is like a denial of yourself and your personal like bodily cravings to say that I want God more than everything that's going on around me, even things that are innate within me. And so I'm going to pour my devotion and attention and desire, I'm going to order that towards God rather than, kind of cave to everything that's going on around me. So it's almost like an outlet, like I'm turning myself like in reality to God despite things that may be going wrong. And so I think that's one healthy way that fasting can be done. I don't think you only fast when things are going bad or wrong or something. But I think your experience there kind of lines up with the biblical testimony in my view.
Yeah, and that's probably why he had us do it, because he was pretty well spiritually set. He was a pretty knowledgeable guy. I will say, when you said innate, I heard innate. Like innate. And it said not just in ourselves, but, the things that are innate. And I was like, innate as well? This is funny. We got lined up. So, speaking of, Nate, what has your experience been with fasting?
Yeah, so fasting has been viewed, I guess from my perspective, as more of a health-related practice. There's a huge wealth of information, and it's really popular right now to talk about intermittent fasting, which is essentially it's fasting for shorter periods of time in order to basically reset the body. So intermittent fasting can be done every day, it can be done a couple times a week, or it can be done for longer stretches of time, once a week or a couple times a month. It's really interesting too. So there's this series on Disney Plus called Limitless with Chris Hemsworth, and he plays Thor in the Marvel movies, and he's a great actor and everything. And this series on Disney Plus is from National Geographic. It's actually directed by Darren Aronofsky, and it's wonderful. I mean, it is a fantastic series, and every episode is Chris Hemsworth overcoming a specific challenge related to physical limitations. So the first episode is stress proof, and so in that entire episode he's trying to learn more about his body's stress reaction and ultimately tame it in order for him to accomplish a task. And that task at the very end is a 30-foot crane walk there and back 30 feet on top of a skyscraper in Sydney, Australia.
Golly.
So you can imagine, just picture it in your mind, a skyscraper, extremely tall building. There's a crane extending over the edge of it, and you have to walk out there and back, and do it in a way to where you don't shut down and actually accomplish it. So it's really interesting. The whole premise of the show is awesome, and one of the episodes is on fasting. And so they have Chris Hemsworth meet with Dr. Peter Attia, and he's kind of a wellness health expert. He has a great book called Outlive. I really want to read it. I haven't read it yet. But in that episode, they have Chris go on a 4-day fast. Water only, so 4 days, no eating.
It's pretty significant.
It's very significant, and they talk about what's actually going on in the body when that happens, and it's really interesting because essentially, I'm gonna probably butcher this, and somebody's gonna be yelling at their phone, but just go with me on this because I've only seen it once. So essentially, what happens when you fast is that you move your body from a state of surplus to a state of scarcity. So your body has to use the energy, the carbs, everything that's already in the body for energy. So it breaks down the things in your body versus storing all the excess that you take in regularly. So when your body breaks down those things in your body already, it helps to basically flush the system, because in your veins, in your blood cells, there are, I believe, these things called zombie cells, and it's just dead cells that can actually infect the cells around them. So when you fast, it actually helps to clear out that system, because your body goes into overdrive to use what's already in your system. So
interesting.
It kind of acts as a clearing out of those dead cells, which helps to lead to longevity and actually makes your body more efficient. And so they actually interview a couple of people. They interview a tribe. I can't remember where. I believe it was Kenya. But they interview a tribe, and this tribe, they're a hunter-gatherer society, and so they're regularly hunting, and they go days normally without food in between hunts. And they talk about how it helps them to actually get sharper. It actually sharpens their eyes, so their vision. It sharpens their mind. It kind of puts them into that like single track state of mind, where you're focused on one thing ultimately, and then you go and do that thing. So it's really interesting, because at the end they also have Chris Hemsworth. In order to eat, he has to go out and spearfish for his dinner. So they talk about this chemical component called ketones in your body. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know that the higher the ketones, the more focused and kind of more that like energy burst you get. So the whole show, they're measuring Chris's ketone levels, and it's kind of cool, because at the end they measure his ketones, and it's like he got a spike when he was going out and fishing, and then he's able to actually go out and spearfish. And it's a great show. I would really recommend it, especially if you're interested in health and wellness and all these kinds of things, because for one, it's a beautiful show, but also there's just a wealth of information and knowledge that you get from it as well. So anyway, sorry, that's a super long-winded way of just saying that fasting is really seen in society today as a health activity. And there's a lot of science that backs that up, that there's benefits to fasting for your health. So I feel like fasting is more of a health practice, less so maybe it's more disconnected from the spiritual side of things. And it's really interesting, because when you break down what it is, especially from the spiritual side, so let's switch a little bit from going from health to spiritual, because when you fast, your body only needs 3 things to survive. You need food, water, and shelter, so that you're not exposed to the elements, so that your body is hydrated, and so that your body is fueled. And if you have those 3 things, you can survive. And so when you take that out, when you take food out of that equation, you're literally removing something that your body requires, that it needs in order to survive. In order to take that time and energy and focus it more so on the Lord. And so I think that, one, there's a little bit of a disconnect, because that is just a wild practice in and of itself, to think like, hang on, I'm going to remove one of the things that I need for survival in order so that I can spend more time praying and being with the Lord, and thinking on those things holier than this world. It's a crazy concept to begin with, but there's something that's so important there.
Yeah, so I think you're beginning to bridge on it. I will say really fast, I feel like, we started this episode like, I don't really know if I have anything to say about fasting. I don't know if I have anything, and we're already like, you're recalling all this stuff. So thank you for that, Nate. That was actually really interesting. I think that will come up in our later discussion, like what it's doing to the body, and the way that, like, perhaps this is actually a function of ancient peoples being able to say, we've found that there are cognitive and conscientious benefits to fasting, that like it's almost a training of sorts in whatever practice. And so of course it applies to the spiritual, even though we moderns love to take the spiritual out of things and everything's material. But so the question then is, how have you guys heard, like, in your churches, what is fasting for? Like, how has it been explained to you? Like, here's why we fast as Christians. Like, what does the church say about that?
Yeah, from my recollection, I think I've had pretty good explanations or expositions of fasting in the churches that I've been in. What's been abundantly clear to me as I've looked at fasting, heard about fasting, read about fasting, is that fasting, and even as I'm just right now, I'm kind of surveying the biblical texts that talk about fasting. Like, what's abundantly clear is that fasting has to have a purpose behind it, namely seeking the face of God and seeking His will, or seeking, some sort of possible even like revelation or something from God. I'm not saying like I'm not a charismatic, so I don't speak about revelation maybe the same way you guys might, but
we'll change that one day.
Yeah. Anyways, but like fasting seems to me like biblically speaking to always have some sort of purpose in mind. Like, it doesn't seem to be a category to me to like fast for the sake of fasting. Like, I'm just not going to eat food just because the Bible says so. There's always like, I'm not going to eat food like because I'm seeking God and His will in this specific thing in my life. So like an example of this would be like, I guess I can use a personal experience, is like when I was deciding whether or not to move to Kentucky and what I should do after college, like I really wanted to see what God's will was for me, what I should do when I'm finished with college, like because that had severe implications not just for me but for my family in the future too. And so my purpose, so I fasted personally, and my purpose was I want to understand what God would like me to do in this scenario. And I think that was made clear to me over time. I'm not sure, I can't recollect if it was during that time of fasting that came, but it definitely, as Nate I think was kind of pointing out with his examples, like it helps to like reorient and refocus your mind, like to think clearly about something that you're dealing with in your life. And I think that's what you see like consistently, like biblically. Is like biblical characters, like I was saying earlier, something happens or they desire something, and so they want to understand what God wants for them. And fasting, like denying things that are all of the exterior things that might be impacting you when you're facing a certain scenario, and trying to just solely focus and say, God, I want to understand what you want from me. I want to understand what your will is in this scenario, is extremely clarifying, I would think, and has significant spiritual impact. And so I feel like I've been consistently told kind of that, that explanation of fasting in church, in sermons, what have you, throughout my life. So I guess at the end of the day, what I'm saying is like fasting is to be done with a purpose, and the purpose is to seek what God's will is in your life for whatever it may be. I guess whether it's big or whether it's small, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's me. I don't know what you guys.
Nate, how about you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you,
think,
Eric. That was really good.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, fasting has always, I think, for one, fasting's always been talked about in like times of need, essentially. So like, or whenever fasting is brought up in church, it's always in the context of a need or of a desire to see God move in a specific way. And then, secondly, I think fasting has always been paired with prayer. So when we were at our last church, the young adults pastor had a great sermon on fasting, and he talked about it in the context of actually having a purpose for your fast, not just fasting to fast, which is what you mentioned earlier, Jacob. But fasting in order to understand more about who God is, there's a couple of different things he talked about, but one of the things that he did was invite everybody in the room, which was the whole young adults ministry. He invited everybody into a fast, and he said, hey, actually next week I'm going to invite you guys into a fast, or he's like, on this specific day we're going to fast the entire day. And then he gave a couple of things that we could be praying for or thinking about or being in communication with God about. So like some of those things were just like prayers for the church, or prayers for political leaders, or prayers for the conflicts that were happening in the world. At that time it was Russia, Ukraine was on everybody's mind. So it's like fast with that in mind, fast with prayerful intent to see God move in this way. Or for the community partners or whatever. He gave a whole bunch of different examples, which was awesome. And so then he invited everybody into a fast on Wednesday. So Wednesday night was like everybody's last meal 2 weeks from that sermon. So there was a young adult Slack group, and everybody who was there was in that, and so that's how they got all the communication. So people were encouraged to like have their last meal on Wednesday and then go the entire day through Thursday, no food, and then that was the next like young adults meetup basically, and then everybody would break their fast at dinner at young adults. So it was kind of this beautiful example of like fasting in community, and then breaking that fast also in community for a specific purpose. With prayerful intent as well. So that's kind of the example that stands out to me. I think if I were to try and recall like other sermons on fasting, I don't know, I feel like I haven't seen many sermons specifically on fasting, but they talk about fasting when it's brought up in scripture.
Yes.
And it's just kind of talked about like something they did, or very rarely have I seen a church actually call their congregation to a fast for a specific reason.
Yeah. Well, and beyond that, you could say, definitely the church does not call, at least in the Protestant setting, the churches usually do not call their congregations to regular and routine fasting, right? Like that is very uncommon. Right. No, I think Nate, you were bridging on, like, I would say exactly the point. It's funny, I was looking at some notes that I wrote down from a talk I gave on fasting with my students like a year ago or something like that, and at the very bottom it talks about like fasting for the war in Ukraine. So I wonder if it was around the same time that we were doing this. But yeah, I would say, so in the midst of researching for this one a while back, something interesting stood out to me. It says that I read that there were only a few instances in which the people groups that surrounded Israel, so not Israel, but the people around them, practiced fasting. Fasting was very uncommon in that area, which you would think, like, it would be like a pretty common practice. You would think it's kind of a, like a pre-modern approach to the world, is that fasting is like a genuine, just a general practice, right? No, it was actually very uncommon. And I actually am wondering whether the Judeo-Christian worldview is part of what brought fasting up as a prominent part of the world's continual practices. It is interesting, I'd say, that the major religions that you could point to that fast, I would say, I'm limited in my knowledge here, but I would say are largely Abrahamic. So, maybe there is something there. But regardless, there were a couple of reasons that people around Israel would fast. One of them was if they were sick. So there's that feeling. It's a very bodily thing, right? Like when you're not feeling well, like there are times where you don't feel like you can eat. So you keep yourself from eating. So that was one association with purposefully forgoing food. The other was there were a couple instances, and this is what caught my attention, of if you had fallen in love. So if there was a romantic like moment, an affection that you had towards somebody, it's like that butterflies in the stomach. It makes you like obsessed with that person to the point where you almost begin to forget your own needs, your own bodily needs. So I was like, oh wow, that's really interesting.
That is interesting.
So to tie that to our practices of prayer and fasting, I think there is an element that you could almost say it's like we do, like I think there is an element in which it is a recognition of our sickness, right? We are sick in our souls, and it's maybe a recognition of the sickness of the human condition, that causes us to at times. I think especially like in the face of significant loss, you'll see people go into almost automatic fasting. They just kind of forget to take care of themselves.
Yes.
Right? So like if you lose a loved one, like a really close loved one, so like you lose a child, you lose a parent, you lose a spouse, you'll just see people, I think, tend towards either really unhealthy eating or just not eating at all, because they just don't feel like they can stomach it, right? It's too much. So I think there's a part of it there, like it's almost a bodily reaction to the brokenness that you're confronted with. And then I think in the same way, it can be an obsessive quality. Like you're so obsessed with this thing, with someone or something, that you begin to like forget to take care of your most basic needs. Your appetite for this thing surpasses your appetite for food. It squelches it for a second. So, I would say, in my understanding, it's a little more what Nate was talking about, of like, it's not so much a generic trying to just like come close to God, but usually whenever there's, a sense of fasting in the circles that I walk in, fasting is like particularly tied to situations and circumstances in our lives that we would like to see a reversal of, or that we are mourning and lamenting, right? So there's a specific tie to either that sickness of like, I've seen something so broken that I don't know what to do with it, right? I'm enduring something so broken that I can't help but fast, or the reversal where it's like, I am so obsessed with having this longing met, this appetite fulfilled for me, that I can't think about eating right now, or that I it's almost the bodily expression of that degree of desire and longing. So I thought those were interesting, that specifically those two things were the things that came up as potential reasons why somebody who maybe doesn't even believe in a god, or who believes in many other gods than the gods that we believe in, might fast. It's like, so maybe there is something something really endemic about fasting.
That is interesting. I do wonder though, like, would you call that, like, let's take your example of the individual who like perhaps has a close loved one pass away, like and they're struggling with it, and you said something like, well, something in them, like they just forget to take care of themselves, they forget to eat or something. Like, would you call that fasting, or are you just trying to like make a connecting principle to, like, because I think I would want to make a distinction, like that would seem more like starvation to me, like they're literally starving themselves, like, rather, because they're so like overcome by a traumatic experience. And fasting seems to have a bit more of an intentionality, like, behind it to me, like, biblically speaking. But that being said, I think I see your point, like your underlying point there is that, like, our tendency as human beings to like shove aside our appetite for something that, like, we are dealing with on like a more grand scale, I guess, like, is somewhat innate, I think is what you're saying. Like, it happens innate.
Inside of Nate.
Sorry, I don't know why I keep saying innate. That's weird.
That's really funny though. I can't unhear it.
Yeah.
Like, but every conversation.
I'm gonna start working in Eric.
Anyways,
that's funny.
Do you see what I'm saying though? Like, I think I see like your connecting point there, but I do wonder if we should make a distinction maybe between the two, like, because I'm not sure that I would call that. Absolutely, yeah.
Nate, jump in.
I think that is a great point, Eric, and what I'm thinking about actually goes back to what you were talking about, Jacob, and how fasting wasn't a very common practice in the ancient world. And I was going to make a distinction there between voluntary and involuntary fasting. So voluntary fasting is, the ones that we see for health benefits or for the spiritual practices, as a spiritual practice. And involuntary fasting is when you don't have the ability to eat food, for one. So that could be one of the reasons why it wasn't a very common practice in the ancient world, was because, well, voluntary fasting wasn't very big in the ancient world because involuntary fasting was.
A huge part of their lives,
a big part of their lives was food scarcity, and that's why obesity was actually seen as a sign of wealth for so many, in so many cultures through so many years. That's why a lot of Buddha statues are the images of him obese and overweight. Because that's a sign of plenty. He has access to food and wealth and riches that to where he can satisfy his hunger. And so but involuntary fasting is also along those lines of what Eric is talking about with these traumatic experiences that come up in our life, and it almost kind of breaks you, like it almost breaks your bodily systems, your mental faculties. To the point where it's like, food's not important right now, so I would probably call that involuntary fasting. But I think that a broader point as well, something that I've been kind of working through just in my mind in this conversation, is that, it's such a strange practice to remove the thing that is required for life, sustenance, calories. It's a strange thing to remove that for a period of time. But I think that just goes to show kind of the upside down world of the kingdom, and that that the Lord is able to take these things that we would say, man, that's bad. Like, why would you fast? Like, why, obviously these things are terrible, but he works it for our good. So maybe, I'm thinking of a bunch of different examples as well, like, just to support that point of the upside down kingdom. Nothing good comes out of Nazareth. Well, the Savior comes out of Nazareth. The
unveiling of the reality beyond what we see.
Right, exactly, and how God is the only one who can take what is meant for bad and turns it for good. He can give good meaning to horrible things that happen. Fasting is one of those things. So in voluntary fasting, where you don't choose to fast, I think even in that situation, the Lord can come alongside somebody in that situation and turn that for good and draw near to them. even if they might not have the explicit intent of fasting to be close to the Lord. For somebody who loses a loved one and they are involuntary fasting because their body is rejecting food and they don't eat for several days, or whatever it may be, the Lord can turn that circumstance into something really good and comfort them and give them the peace that surpasses all understanding, and actually come alongside them in that moment and support them through that pain.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'll respond here to both of you. I think to bring up the love sickness and actual sickness that often led or sometimes would lead ancient peoples to fast, I think gives us just some context around what maybe the Israelites were thinking of when the idea of fasting was brought up. I think you could say it's a sign of overwhelm that one fasts. And so I'm not saying that like the purest form of fasting is when you lose a loved one, or when you're lovesick or something like that, but that rather it's when you're fasting, what you're doing is you're almost playing the role of someone who's distraught or overwhelmed. That someone who finds that in their daily taking up of bread, the satisfaction isn't there that is often associated with fulfilling our hunger. That bread just doesn't taste good enough right now because my loved one isn't here with me, or because the person that I love I can't have yet, or I don't have yet. So there's a longing, there's an overwhelm, there's a distress to fasting that I think when you begin to fast, you almost are invited to look into your life and say, where are you overwhelmed? Where are you distressed? Where is God, or where is the food of where is your daily bread not enough for you? Right? Where is God? Where does God not feel tangibly present for you? And I think that's kind of like the invitation of fasting. And I'm not sure that it's actually something that you need to impose over fasting. I think that fasting almost invites those questions, because you're putting your body in the place where it can ask those questions, right?
Yeah, I like what both of you have to say. For me, I'm still grappling with distinctions and what I want to be clear on what fasting actually is, like definitionally speaking. Like for me, like Nate, when you were talking, and making the distinction between voluntary and involuntary fasting, like I think I would steer away, like for something like involuntary fasting. I certainly don't deny that God can't come alongside like somebody who may be suffering from that and impact them in a spiritual and real, like deep type of way. I'm just not sure that I would call that. I'm not sure I would attach the label fasting to that. Like I think I would just call it something else. Like these people are starving and God comes alongside them.
Sure.
Yeah. Because I want to be careful with the word fasting, because I think there's a difference between, what you might call scriptural fasting, or biblical fasting, or Christian fasting, whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to label it, and like the concept of fasting that's kind of prevalent in the world today. So like when you were talking earlier with your Chris Hemsworth example, like sure you can call that fasting. It has all the same mechanics of fasting that he was employing in his real life, but I wouldn't call that like scriptural or biblical fasting. Like it doesn't seem to fit the model. Like I'm just like right now I'm just surveying like all of the texts, and I don't see a single one where like they all seem consistent with one another of like what they're doing with fasting. Like it's always for some, like I was saying earlier, some sort of purpose that they have in mind, whether that be repentance, what to do, like you see in the Acts narratives, like what to do with the church, and how to proceed, like or mourning over a certain event and wondering what to do with that or something. There's always like some undergirding principle where they're seeking God, like for some reason, whatever that reason may be. And like like for the example with somebody who might be involuntary fasting, if you want to put that label on it, or like Chris Hemsworth, like that intention doesn't seem to be there. And so I'm making a distinction between like somebody who's seeking to fast in the biblical type of way, and like what others might call fasting that I think lacks that undergirding principle, I guess. So definitionally, I just want to be careful, because I don't want to label some things as fasting and people walk around saying I'm fasting, but like that same intention isn't there. So like an example I think of this is like, when Jesus is saying in Matthew 6, and he's talking about fasting and saying like, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites, don't disfigure your face, things like that. Like you can call that fasting. It has all the same mechanics, but like the underlying principle is like their intention was wrong. Like they're doing it for the wrong reasons. So like I don't know. Am I kind of making sense? Are you guys getting what I'm saying? So
no, I think the distinction has to be made. Like there have to be distinctions made. So in the ancient world, it would have been the distinction between starvation and fasting, which I think is one that we don't commonly see, at least in the West nowadays. So it's not a distinction. I mean, like, it's kind of obvious, right? And then I think for us in the West, it's the distinction between fasting for health purposes and fasting for the sake of our souls. I think there's a mass difference there, absolute difference. Yeah.
Here's something else to think about too, that this almost goes against the point that I was just making. I think maybe, but like I'm struggling in my mind too about, because I forget which one of you mentioned it, but like I think it was you, Jacob. Like the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, and I would imagine the Anglican Church as well. Some of the more high church settings will have like a ritualistic setting where they call their congregations to fast. And I don't want to say that that's like wrong, because I was just making the point about like intention behind fasting. Clearly, I think like intention should be there, but like, should we say like, if you're like, I want to steer away from saying like you have to like 100% like know that your intention is like in the right spot. Like you have to be like morally perfect, like to fast or something, like with your intention behind it, because like
that could be the other side of the
you see what I'm saying? So like I don't want to say like I'm totally against like a ritualistic fast or something like that, perhaps even what the Pharisees were doing like in Matthew 6 that Jesus is talking against, but I'd also don't want to like totally steer it away to where there's no intention behind fasting whatsoever. I think we just got to be cautious of both of those ends, I think.
Would the issue in that situation that you're describing, Eric, be like a pastor of church calling the people into a fast, but the people not being in the right frame of mind and not having the right heart posture towards that fast? Rather they just feel obligated to because everybody's being asked to. Is that kind of like the issue that you see in that?
So like in my mind right now, there's like a dichotomy, because Jacob brought up, some of the higher church settings like will call for like a fast of their congregation. And on the flip side of that, you have more of like I would say like the evangelical approach to it nowadays. At least I think the biblically faithful ones will be like fast, but your heart has to be in the right place to do it. And like I see the danger on both ends of that, because if you don't have the ritual, the danger of that becomes, well, you have to have like 100% like inner certainty that you're fasting for the right reasons in order to do it, and then all of a sudden like nobody fasts, because everybody's always going to have some excuse to not do it, like because they're not certain about it. And then on the other end of that, like the critique is, well, if we just make it like a rigid ritualistic type thing, like then people are just going to fast and their intentions are going to be all wrong, and then like below and behold we're left with what Jesus was talking against with the Pharisees in Matthew 6. So like do you see the dilemma I'm kind of putting myself in right here?
Yeah. So like one way to maybe help clarify the that which makes fasting what it is it's and maybe the way that you could create an environment where there is a routine fasting or a rhythmic fasting that's brought into the Christian experience and the calendar of our lives without devolving it into just like an obligation or a ritualistic practice is I think if you become too individualistic in your understanding of what fasting is, there may not be a good reason to fast. But we are one body, and where one of us is hurting, all of us ought to be hurting, right? Like that's like I think how Paul kind of portrays the body is that like where one is suffering, all suffer. So fasting, I think, can be the occasion in which we remember the suffering of others. And so things like fasting for our brothers and sisters who are suffering in Ukraine, right, or in Israel, Palestine, that whole situation, or even just our neighbor down the street who's suffering from, maybe they got laid off, or whatever else. I think there's a way in which you can always gear fasting towards the love of your neighbor and the seeking of God's providence and goodness for your neighbor's sake. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the way that you keep a routine fast, is that you highlight that the body suffers together. And actually, I think this goes to the real heart of Christian fasting, which, because there's fasting, like I said, in basically any of the Abrahamic religions, and probably in religions outside of that as well nowadays. And so fasting is not unique to Christians. So what makes a fast Christian, I would say, is if it looks like the cross. So if it's the taking up of suffering for the sake of your neighbor. And I think that's where a lot of Christian fasting falls short, especially in the American context, because I think, I'm just thinking about my own experiences with fasting. Fasting for me has always come from my own distress, from my own preoccupations with things, or desire to seek God. So it's a very individualistic and self-centered approach, and I think we get the kind of the seedbed of this idea of maintaining the place of the neighbor and the love of your neighbor in fasting. When we see, I'm trying to find the passage where it comes up. I think it's in Isaiah where God talks about what it means to truly fast, and he says basically share your bread with the hungry. And so I think a lot of Christians will fast, and whatever they don't use money-wise for the food that they're forgoing, they give to someone in need. I think that's a great tangible way of loving your neighbor in the midst of fasting. So then even if you're fasting with, you can't get your heart in the right place, you're tangibly loving your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
You're doing something for the sake of your neighbor. But I think even if you don't do that, I think there's a way that if you fast for the sake of your neighbor, right? So you take a time a week, and even if you don't have anything you're bringing to God for your own self or for your family, your situation, your life, you can insert the needs and place of your neighbor into your heart, and it becomes an occasion to remember and to love your neighbor.
That's great. Yeah, I really like that you brought in loving your neighbor in the fasting. That's, even in my own mind, I think I was thinking more individualistically even right there. So that's that's good.
Well, and it's not uncommon. Our American context, I think almost every spiritual practice boils down to an individualistic enterprise. So right. It's most of the time I'm thinking in individual terms as well.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So okay, I just kind of want to like summarize what you're saying so I can make sure like we're following the point. You were saying that fasting essentially should look to the cross or look like the cross, and you from there you ask the question, well, what does that mean? And essentially, like, the cross represents the ultimate love for neighbor, where Christ dies for his people and undeserving people, and in the same way, we follow that example of love for neighbor by fasting and seeking the betterment or the better good, I guess you could say, for our neighbor, whatever that may look like in whatever context you find yourself in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe to push it even further, like, or to root it into the life of Christ, there's a point where Christ goes to fast, and it's like the famous story, right?
Yeah.
He goes into the wilderness for 40 days to fast, which is a mirroring of Moses going up on the mountain for 40 days in the face of the Lord and not eating bread or drinking anything. So,
which, by the way, I looked that up, and yeah, I think it's Exodus 34. That's the first occurrence of fasting in the Bible too that I saw as well.
Yeah, so that's cool. It kind of paints our perspective on what fasting, like the heart, the iconic fasting could be. But anyway, so Jesus goes out into the desert, and he's walking around, and he's being tempted, and you could say, well, he was just trying to like grow in his holiness or something else. But what's interesting is right after that is when he begins his ministry.
Yes.
So to some degree, it's not just that you can utilize fasting to bring up the cause of your neighbor, but fasting can become the occasion by which you are sharpened for the sake of your neighbor. So Christ goes out into the wilderness, and for 40 days he has to resist temptation and to walk in the Spirit, and immediately after that begins proclaiming the kingdom of God. So it's that I think there are times in our life where we might be called to fasting or to disciplines of a sort like that, where the true recipient of our labors, the fruit that like could be harvested from that, will actually not go to us, but will go to those around us. And I think that's a way of kind of abstracting the principle beyond just the concrete of fasting. From food.
That's really good. Yeah. So let me back it up a little bit, because I kind of want to trace our line of thought, like give a bit of a summary of where we've gone so far in this episode, to make sure we're consistent and everybody's following along. So we kind of started out with definitional pieces of fasting and how we viewed it in our own experiences. We talked about it being needing to have a purpose and the meaning of having an intent behind it, and then we kind of gave some nuances to that, and we even talked about the actual physical ramifications of what fasting does to your body, is what Nate was talking about, and then even how people unbeknownst to them follow the pattern of fasting, whether or not we want to call it fasting, we follow that pattern when we face hard times in life, unbeknownst to ourselves even sometimes. And I hope that didn't... I just got a call. I hope that didn't ruin my recording, but it should be fine. It looks like it's fine. So, and then all of that I feel was... well, maybe it wasn't inherently individualistic, and I don't want anybody to get us wrong. I think there is certainly instances where fasting is going to be individualistic for certain things, and that might be going on in your life. However, I think that was really significant, Jacob, that connection you made right there between the Exodus account and Jesus's fasting, because certainly there's a link between the two. It mirrors, the stories mirror each other, almost one for one. Where fasting is inherently, at least in some circumstances, we should be looking for the betterment of our neighbor and not just ourselves. Maybe you could even say, maybe you can disagree with me if I say this, maybe even sometimes fasting for an individual purpose can be for the betterment of neighbors as well, because the way we act in our lives will inevitably have an impact on other people as well.
I would say that's the pinnacle there. It's where you begin to see you're fasting no longer as a direct relation to like the fruit that's being borne out by your prayers or whatever else, right? Like, so it's not so much about like I am fasting so that I might get this or so that this might be solved, but rather it's you begin to see fasting as the formation of your character so that you can love your neighbor, right?
Perfect. Yep. Love that. Yeah. And so fasting ultimately, I mean, I guess to put like a blanket statement on it, should be like to the glory of God, for God's own glory, to make him known, whatever that might be, however that might pop up in your own life. Mm-hmm. Fasting is making sure your appetite is for God first, which will inevitably leak out into your relationships with other people, I guess. Did I cover most everything there? How, like, kind of our line, how we went? I wanted to make sure we weren't just like going off into rabbit trails and things like that, because I think it's all connected. But
I'm impressed that you can remember all that. That's pretty cool. It's a cool skill.
Yeah. So I guess I kind of missed. We want to definitionally, I think, put up the guardrails on like certain things that happen with fasting. So, like, what is like the biblical model for fasting and the parallels we might see with that model and things that happen in the world, whether that be like we were kind of talking about like voluntary and involuntary fasting, or fasting that we see other people do like in the culture nowadays, like intermittent fasting or the Chris Hemsworth thing or something like that. And then we also want to put up the guardrails like for like how fasting is to be done like in the church today, kind of more ritual versus individual intent laden fasting, however you want to put it. And it almost seemed to me, Jacob, like when you were breaking that part down, like you would lean more towards like a ritualistic fasting, because you can always like bend that to like something outside of yourself. Like there's always something you can do to make it fasting for one's neighbor, which would be in alignment with the Exodus narrative, like you were saying, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think ritual is the lost piece for a lot of our communal engagement with God. I think we lose the ability to commune with God with each other when we don't have ritual and routine, because everybody's on their own schedule, everybody's doing their own thing. And I think that connecting with God together is one of the key pieces of maintaining that our love of God does not become a hate of the neighbor, right? Like, oh my gosh, the amount of times that love of God, like a Pharisee, right? The love of God becomes this kind of like vitriol against neighbor or vitriol against the world, and no longer a suffering love. I mean, like that. It's the tendency is for that, like, you know, it becomes zeal for the Lord rather than love of the Lord, and so I think ritual is a way by which we can maintain a liturgical, a calendric, devotion to God with each other.
Yeah,
maintaining those bonds. So yeah, very, very. I would say it's crucial to have a ritual.
I have a quote on that point. This quote, I'm glad I remembered it because it hit me when I was reading it earlier. This is actually I'm quoting a book that's quoting a book, so this is a quote of a quote. Love that.
That's seminary in a nutshell, huh?
Yeah, isn't it? So this is for anybody who might want to read the book. It's called Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. It's by Don Whitney. This isn't a quote specifically about fasting, and it's not about ritual per se, but you might as well substitute the word ritual, the word he uses, which I think is pretty much the same as discipline, obviously.
Sure.
So here's this quote about discipline that I think is in line with what you're saying about ritual. It says, "Discipline has become a dirty word in our culture. I know I am speaking heresy in many circles, but spontaneity is greatly overvalued. The spontaneous person who shrugs off the need for discipline is like the farmer who went out to gather the eggs As he walked across the farmyard toward the hen house, he noticed the pump was leaking, so he stopped to fix it. It needed a new washer, so he set off to the barn to get one. But on the way, he saw that the hayloft needed straightening, so he went to fetch the pitchfork. Hanging next to the pitchfork was a broom with a broken handle. I must make a note to myself to buy a broom handle the next time I get to town, he thought. By now it's clear that the farmer's not going to get his eggs gathered, nor is he likely to accomplish anything else he sets out to do. He's utterly gloriously spontaneous, but he is hardly free. He is, if anything, a prisoner to his unbridled spontaneity. The fact of the matter is that discipline is the only way to freedom. It is the necessary context for spontaneity.
I feel called out.
So, yeah, we mentioned spontaneity in the beginning, and I'll admit myself, like in personal practice with fasting, I'm not good about keeping a routine fast or a disciplinary fast, I guess you could say. I tend to be the one that fasts, like if a big moment or something comes around or something like that, or if I feel called out from a sermon or something.
Probably better than nothing, but
it is better than nothing. I don't want to go too far in what I'm saying, but nevertheless, in continuity with a more ritualistic fast, I guess you could say, I think that quote is meaningful.
Yeah. One other element that I do think we need to bring up before we close here is there are a lot of people nowadays. I work with students, so there's I hear this often. Whenever we do a fast, there's the question, well, I have an eating disorder, or I have, negative trauma with food. Is there another way that I can implement this in my life that is equally valuable, right? So can I fast from my phone? Can I fast from social media? Can I fast from, whatever else, right? Can I fast from school for a day, or my homework, or, take a Sabbath? Is there something else that I can do, basically? So what do you guys think about people attempting to substitute for fasting something else, some other, regular drive?
Yeah, I think in principle it still follows all of the same mechanics of fasting when you're like not doing something else for the purpose of like seeking God. I just wouldn't call it biblical fasting, because it seems to me every time you read about it in scripture, it always has to do with food. That being said, I think there's a number of ways that the Bible, and I'm going to credit most of what I'm saying here to my spiritual disciplines professor, Don Whitney, that I was talking about.
Right.
But scripture lays out a number of different ways that you can fast. It isn't always like no food and water in every account that you come across in the scriptures. Like, some people drink water, during their fast. I would say most people, even today, probably drink water throughout their fast. I think in the book of Daniel, you see, maybe it's not Daniel, but I think it's...
Oh, yeah, no, it's Daniel. I know what you're talking about.
They eat vegetables, like, as they're fat, and it ascribes fasting as they're doing that. They're not eating other foods except vegetables as they go on.
There's a part in Daniel... Hold on, I have it written down here. Yeah, it says... I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food. No meat or wine touched my lips.
Is that Daniel 10?
No lotions. I don't know. I don't have the reference here, but it's in my notes. It's probably like Daniel 10. It's after all the stories.
Yeah. There are instances in scripture where you will see things like a supernatural fast. Like, I think Jesus' 40-day fast seems supernatural when you read it.
Absolutely.
Like, no food and water. I think it happens in Ezekiel as well, if I remember right. Where they're not eating food or water for like 40 days or something like that. It's like physically impossible. Where I think you have to say it's something supernatural. But
I think most of the time when I hear fasting brought up, it's just food. I don't hear, like, I know the Moses thing, there's a qualification that he also doesn't drink water, which is crazy. Yeah. But it doesn't say that in the Gospels, and I don't know about the Ezekiel one. I haven't looked at that, but
I could be mixing up my
drink
account.
Water.
Yeah.
If you're gonna fast.
Yeah. All of that to say, where I was getting to is like there doesn't seem to be like there's actually let me change how I'm going to say it. There's multiple models for how one can fast in a biblical way. And so if you have an eating disorder or something, I don't think that's like a go ahead to say that I can't fast or I should never fast. I think there's ways to fast. I mean, you can like abstain from like watching TV or being on your phone or something like that. I just think that's not the biblical model. Scripture doesn't talk about fasting from things that are not food, you know. So I mean, talk with your doctor, like do what it takes. But like, I think if the goal is to honor the scriptural model, I think there's ways to fast that still probably can accommodate like how you might be approaching it in your personal life. And like another note on that too, like fasting doesn't have to be like a 40-day event like Christ, you know. It can be a meal, you know. It could be 2 meals, 3 meals, whatever it might be. We're not saying you have to starve yourself for days when you fast. The point I'm getting at is there's ways to do it and honor the scriptures.
That's good. I think there's and I want to hear what Nate has to say as well on that. I would say, as long as like there's places like, so I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians, I think it's 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says, you know, do not what's the word that he uses? Do not deprive one another. Do not deprive one another. He's talking about sexual intercourse. He says, do not deprive one another of this intimacy, except for a period of time, so that you may come together, so that you may go and pray, right? An agreed upon measure of time. I think there are other places where you see something like an abstention from a good, right? So ceasing from something that's good, or that is, even if it's not good, it's normal, right, to the human life. And so I would just say, just call it, I'm abstaining, right? You don't have to call it a fast, right? Like we can. But I think you're right, Eric. Like, I think there's a particularity to fasting that, like, it involves food, in the same sense that I would say, like, we shouldn't call just getting together with a group of friends church, and we shouldn't call
eating like, crackers and hot chocolate and calling that communion,
right? There's a certain there's a certain patterning that needs to be maintained just for the sake of the tradition, right? Like you know, have mercy on the tradition, right? But yeah, like I think there's certainly precedent for abstaining for other things, for spiritual purposes, for prayer, right? So just call it you're abstaining or you're ceasing. I'm taking a pause. I'm breaking away for a season. Whatever you want to call it.
Right.
You don't have to call it a fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nate, I mean, because
from you though too.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to, I guess, summarize and kind of maybe give a response to people that are like, well, you know, I'm worried about my health or all those types of things. I think that there are other ways to fast or to abstain. Like Jacob said, I think that's a great word to use maybe instead, because the point of fasting is the hunger. It's to get to that point where you need something for your survival, but you are relying on the Lord ultimately. Not to the point of death, by any means, but to the point where you feel the desire for that thing that is life-sustaining, and you fill it with the Lord. Yeah. That is the point. And so, yeah, you can quotes fast or abstain, you know, from your phone, but that's not required for life. You know, you might feel the hunger towards your phone or whatever, and you can fill that obviously with the Lord, and remind yourself that, yeah, life is going to be okay. I'm going to be okay if I don't have my phone for a day or a week or whatever. But fasting from food takes it to that next level because it's required for life. That's what makes it so insane, you know, and what makes it such a good practice in order to turn your mind towards the Lord, because you are holding that key ingredient from your life. So if I were to boil it down, the point of fasting is the hunger, or the hunger is the point, and because that points you and leads you ultimately to Christ. It points you back to your Maker, who is ultimately the true and full sustainer of your life. More so than any food. Food is temporary. What is it? It's like, if you eat one thing, you're going to get hungry again. But if you have the bread of life, you'll never be hungry.
Oh, yeah. John 6.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, that's really the point. Now obviously, the point of fasting is not to go to death. It's not to starve yourself or anything like that. So fast, but be healthy. And you can modify your fast, and even, like juice cleanses nowadays are really just kind of like fasts, because there's not really any sustenance. Fruit smoothies are just like sugars, to give you enough glucose to get you through the day, but you're depriving yourself of so many calories that it's really like a modern fast. Where was I going with that? Anyway, you can modify your fast. You don't have to abstain from all food, much like we saw in Daniel.
Yeah.
You can abstain from choice foods, that being meat, very high protein, and alcohol. And you can just do veggies. You can scale back the amount of food you have in a day dramatically, but if you have certain medical conditions, it's like, stay healthy. Like, please, we urge you to stay healthy, and yet at the same time fast in a way that gets you to the point of feeling hungry for the Lord. If that makes sense.
Yep, that's great. Just one little point I was going to make. This pertains to what you both said. Like, in case somebody wants to object against what we're saying and say no, like me not looking at my phone is fasting. If you're going to say that that's fasting, you're also going to have to deny that there's a category for the Sabbath as well, because you're going to have to say the Sabbath is fasting from work, and just deny biblical categories if you're going to say that. So what I'm saying and what I want to be careful of is that there is a category for fasting, and biblically speaking, it always has to do with food, every single time. What Jacob was saying is the category of just call it abstaining or something like that is really helpful, because it makes the category distinction between fasting and something else.
Yeah, and it's still good, right?
Yes,
to fast from work, right, or it's a Sabbath, is good. It just because you can't call it a fast doesn't mean, or you shouldn't call it a fast, doesn't mean that it's not a good thing, right? It's not like fasting is the only thing, right? There are categories for abstention beyond fasting, for abstinence. So, shall I close this?
I think so.
Do it.
All right. Well, this has been awesome, my friends. I'll add a quick note. I'm so sorry if you guys hear on the recording background noise, because there's a guy leaf blowing right outside. I swear, I don't realize how loud the place I live in is until I start recording. I become hyper aware of every sound.
I didn't realize until we started talking we have our little air purifier thing going on.
Right.
So I'm sure I have a white noise in my entire thing, unfortunately.
We're still amateurs, so
I can see I just got this super nice mic from my friend, and I'm it doesn't even matter if it's a nice mic if it just picks up every background noise, right? Oh man.
Well, yours has the built-in little audio filter thing or whatever, right? Though.
I'm still screwing with how to make that work right. I hope it's working. Right now I hope it's working, but I can see the waveforms being affected by the leaf blower and stuff, and I'm gosh dang it. So,
we'll get it.
Anyways. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Triclinium, guys. If you have any comments or suggestions on what we should talk about next, any questions, go ahead and reach out to sophomorosofficial@gmail.com. That's SOPHOMOROS official@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And as always, may Christ be exalted.